16 years ago, I ended up leaving corporate America. I resigned my job to start my own business. And that was, I think, really hard for my dad to understand. Like, he was like, why would you? I mean, at the time I was working for Sony Electronics. I was head of brand and strategy, first female vice president of the company, all these accolades, all these great things. And he's like, why would you leave that to go work on your own? And I just had to do what I felt was right for me and a good fit for me. And I think by now he's not only accepted it, but hopefully he's proud of my decision.
Podcasting from Boulder, Colorado. This is the Baby Got Backstory podcast, where we dive into the story behind the story of today's most inspiring storytellers, creators, and entrepreneurs. I like big backstories, and I cannot lie. I am your host, Mark Gutman. I'm Mark Gutman, and on today's episode of Baby Got Backstory, we are talking with brand expert Denise Lee Yohn. All right. Now, if you like and enjoy the show, please take a minute or two to rate and review us over at iTunes. iTunes uses these as part of the algorithm that determines ratings on the Apple charts. And ratings help us to build an audience, which then helps us to continue to produce this show. And we like producing the show, so please give us a rating if you think we deserve it. On today's episode, we are talking to Denise Lee Yohn. You may or may not recognize her name, but you would certainly recognize her face. Denise is the de facto branding expert when TV news shows need insights on the branding crisis of the day. Facebook or Starbucks in trouble? Denise is on TV as the branding expert. You've undoubtedly heard her insights. And as you'll hear, Denise initially cultivated her brand building approaches through several high-level positions in advertising and client-side marketing. She served as the lead strategist at advertising agencies for Burger King, Land Rover, and Unilever, and as the marketing leader and analyst for Jack in the Box restaurants and Spiegel catalogs. Denise went on to head Sony Electronics' first ever brand office, where she garnered major corporate awards as the vice president and general manager of brand and strategy. And today, she is a sought-after keynote speaker, consultant, and expert on branding. And this is her story. So we're here today with Denise Lee Yohn, and Denise is the go-to expert on brand leadership. She's often appears on all the major networks when there's a big brand question, such as like what's Facebook doing with their advertising, or how they're responding to criticism about how they're doing business. She's a keynote speaker and consultant, and a very great writer. She's the author of the best-selling book, What Great Brands Do, the 7 brand building principles that separate the best from the rest, and Fusion, how integrating brand and culture powers the world's greatest companies. And Denise, you are considered an expert on branding. So when you were a young girl...
No, I only play one on TV, Mark, just so you know.
Sometimes that's enough, right? That's all. So when you were a young girl, when you were like, 8, 9, 10, did you think that you were going to have a career in branding? Were you always drawn to branding?
Well, it's interesting because a couple years ago, I moved homes and I was looking through some old files. And I found a paper that I'd written in high school about Nike. And I was kind of in elementary school when Nike was coming out really big, if that gives you any sense of my age and the time period. But even back then, I was fascinated by Nike, the brand. And so I don't know if I knew that I'd end up doing what I'm doing today, but definitely that passion for brands has been with me for a long time.
Yeah, and back then, what was it about Nike that was interesting to you?
Well, I think it was the first brand that people, or at least in my world, that people felt like they wanted to show off and to wear their logos and kind of have T-shirts with the names on it, and that people had some sort of connection to the brand beyond just the product. And, from that time till now, I'm just really curious as to how brands seduce people almost, to get them to buy them, pay more for them, even love them.
Yeah, and I think that, you hit on a really interesting point that there's been this evolution of brands and what it means. And, for a while it was kind of just to signify a difference in production or packaging, but we are now moving into this era of brands as communities, as self-identification, as, something that we identify with beyond the product and service. And what's your thoughts on that and how that has changed from when you first encountered that Nike brand, which was starting to have that feeling, and where we're at today?
Right. Well, your question is so timely because just yesterday I was giving a keynote to a client about iconic brands, and I talked about Nike, and I said that most brands these days know they need to have some sort of emotional appeal. So the fact that a brand creates some sort of emotional connection is really not news really anymore. What is different about brands like Nike and we talked about Trader Joe's and even Impossible Foods, is that it prompts people to identify, as you said, with that brand, to see something in that brand that, makes them feel that the brand not only gets them, but is also for them and inspires them to be, to be a better person. There's that quote from that movie, As Good as It Gets, when Jack Nicholson's character says to Helen Hunt's character, "You make me want to be a better man." I think, the best brands do that for their customers. They make them want to, they strike a chord in the customer in such a way that makes the customer want to be something better, to do something better. And the brand is part of that journey to that better.
Yeah. And so that's where we are today, but I still want to go back. And so I know you live in San Francisco now. Did you grow up in the Bay Area as well?
No, I'm a Midwest girl. I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, and then went to college in Chicago. So my very formative years were all in the Midwest. And I think, back then, maybe the emotional appeal of a brand, and particularly a brand like Nike, was kind of more as a status symbol, or, kind of you're wearing the brand as a badge. I think what happened, one of the things that happened between then and now is the plethora of options and, similar products that are out there. So much so that, it's pretty difficult for a brand today to differentiate based on a product alone or a product feature alone in any sustainable way. I mean, they might be able to come out with news, but it's easily copied or outdone by someone else. And so I think that part of the response to that reality that companies found themselves in was to understand, or to discover that they could actually create an emotional connection with the customer that was beyond the product, that was more about those feelings of identification, aspiration, and that kind of reconsideration that a brand might prompt for people. But I think it's whether a company's intended to do that or whether they just found that was necessary, it has been an evolution. I don't think that brands play the kind of role that they play now that they did back then.
Yeah, not at all. And, so you, went to school in Chicago, and where'd you go to school there?
Northwestern.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. I'm actually recording this from a temporary location just about 5 hours north of there on Lake Michigan in the Midwest in northern Michigan before we get back to Colorado. But so you're in Northwestern, and were you studying marketing and branding at that time? Did you have any inkling that this would be your path forward?
Well, actually, there was some time when I was choosing which school I was going to go to and, what I was going to study, that I actually thought I wanted to be a lawyer. Now, you have to understand that this was the era when LA law was really big. So I'm dating myself now. But, I like being an attorney and working in a law firm seemed really glamorous. And so I thought, oh, that might be for me. And so I went to Northwestern just to get a basic liberal arts background, thinking that if I decided to go and be an attorney, I would go into law school. And so that would be a good foundation. And it would also just open me up to other ideas. I guess at the time, I didn't really seriously consider, I want to go work for an advertising agency or marketing communications. And even if I did, Northwestern's College of Arts and Sciences doesn't have a major like that. They have a communications major in their journalism school, but not in the liberal arts school. So I just kind of said, maybe I'll just do a liberal arts study. And I ended up double majoring in psychology and political science. But along that way, I did an internship at a law firm and realized all that glamour from the TV show was completely false. I myself, and I would see other junior lawyers spending hours and hours in this like stuffy library poring over these Martin Hubbledale books that were it was just awful. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to be an attorney. So one of the things I did at Northwestern was I sold advertising for the Daily Northwestern, the student newspaper. And that got me really into the whole thing about, well, maybe I could make advertising a career. And so my first job out of school was in market research.
And did you do that in Chicago, or did you move away from Northwestern at the time?
Yes. So Spiegel catalogs, again, I feel like I'm really dating myself by talking about all these old brands and old circumstances. But
classic, iconic
catalog,
is what we prefer to say.
Yeah. It really was. I mean, I have to say that in Spiegel's heyday, I mean, and when I worked there, that was definitely a time of growth and real, like, Spiegel was part of the culture, really. It's not only in fashion, but also in home furnishings, et cetera. I was a market research and market research analyst, and there I really learned how to understand customers. What are the research tools that you can use to understand how they're making purchase decisions, how they develop brand perceptions, how they end up favoring one brand over others. So it was a really great continuation of my education, that first job.
Yeah, and what did your parents think of all this? I mean, you left to go to school to be a lawyer, and we didn't really talk about it. I mean, you mentioned you had the foresight to be like, this is not for me, but were they crushed? Were they bummed?
Well, both of my parents were. My mom passed away. My dad is still living. Chemical engineers. And so they thought that they wanted their kids to be engineers or do something very practical, sciencey. But my older sister ended up going to MIT and getting her degree in computer science and engineering. And so she took care of that. And I was like, okay, fine, she's going to go be the good daughter, and I'll go be the rebellious daughter and do a liberal arts background. They ended up being fine with it. But I do have to say that, being an Asian American, and my parents definitely had different expectations for me than maybe some of my Anglo counterparts, where they did think that, you needed to have a serious career. But once I got hired by Spiegel, I think they realized, okay, this could be a serious career.
Yeah, and they were cool with that, because I do remember, like, even when I was coming up, I never really, like, when I came out of college, I didn't really understand marketing. And I think I kind of thought it was all logos and colors and, kind of catalog layouts. And, that was just, obviously incorrect interpretation, or the way I thought of it. But I don't know if other people thought that as well. I mean, were they like, okay, this is legit? Or were they thinking, we're not so sure about this marketing thing?
Yeah, no, I think that, all they wanted to know was I was going to bring home a steady paycheck, and, I was working for a reputable company, and, which sets up a transition that I don't know if you want me to jump to, but eventually so this in 2004. So what, 2004. So 16 years ago, I ended up leaving corporate America. I resigned my job to start my own business. And that was, I think, really hard for my dad to understand. Like, he was like, why would you, at the time I was working for Sony Electronics. I was head of brand and strategy, first female vice president of the company, all these accolades, all these great things. And he's like, why would you leave that to go work on your own? And I just had to do what I felt was right for me and a good fit for me. And I think by now he's not only accepted it, but hopefully he's proud of my decision.
Yeah, and I want to get there, and I want to talk about that. But so you're here at Spiegel, and you're learning about marketing. Yeah. You're learning about customer analytics, and at that point, are you like, this is where I want to be, or are you just kind of like I was probably at that age, which was, I'm working, I'm hanging out, I'm kind of figuring out the world, and I'm not sure what's going to happen next?
I'm trying to remember. I'm not sure. I don't know if I could answer definitively. I do know that at that time, work and career became a very important part of my life. And, I remember from those early years really deriving a lot of joy and satisfaction out of working and excelling. Fortunately, my boss at Spiegel not only empowered me in so many ways and taught me so much in market research, but she actually, we set up a phone center where we were actually doing outbound survey calls to people back when people would answer their phones and do research over the phone. And she basically said, go set up this call center. And so everything from identifying the technology and the software that we're going to use to hiring the employees to working with our existing contact centers to get space to use, everything she just said, go do. And I did. And so I really just enjoyed devoting myself to projects and to work that ultimately was just really, I think, meaningful, not only for the company, but for me.
Yeah. And so what did the trajectory of that career at Spiegel look like? Did you stay there long?
No, I was there for probably a couple of years. And the story goes that I was dating a guy I met in college. He was actually a couple of years younger than me. And so, fortunately, I got a job in Chicago and he was still at Northwestern. And so we continued to date. And like I said, the story goes that he was applying to grad schools. He asked me to marry him. I said yes. And then he said, oh, great, because we're going to move to San Diego. I was like, oh, okay. And, back then my whole life had been the Midwest. And I thought, California, the people out there, they're just fruits and nuts. I'm not going to go there. But I had made the commitment to my husband. So we packed up and moved out to San Diego. And I got another consumer research job at Jack in the Box restaurants.
Jack in the Box restaurants. And so that's awesome. And you go out to San Diego, and that must have been, first of all, quite a change. I mean, I don't know how much you know about me, but I had a very similar kind of path. I went to school at University of Michigan and ended up in Los Angeles for a while. And it was awesome, but it was also a big shock, right? It was very different.
Definitely.
So you're in San Diego and you're working at Jack in the Box. And what's going on there for you from a career and a brand standpoint?
Yeah. So started out in consumer research, then became a product manager where my role was to introduce new products, essentially new menu items. I introduced 4 different burgers and sandwiches in the time that I was a product manager. And then eventually I took over, went back into the research group and headed up research analytics for the company. But what was really formative about that time at Jack in the Box is some of your listeners may recall that there was a foodborne illness crisis that happened at Jack in the Box. A few people ate our burgers and died, and a lot got really sick. And so overnight, our business went from kind of booming and growing to dying, basically. And for about maybe a year, over a year, we tried everything to resurrect our business. Practically giving away our food for free, investing tons in advertising, et cetera. And nothing really would jumpstart the business. And then the head of Marcom at the time hired Chiat Day, the advertising agency in Los Angeles, who was responsible for many famous commercials, the 1984 commercial from Apple, the Taco Bell little Yo Quiero Taco Bell dog, all these really famous ads. And they introduced the Jack CEO character, which is still around today. At the time when they introduced this character, they had done a bunch of research to understand how people felt about the business. And Jack represented this leadership of the company, even though he was just he has this big clown ball head, and he's obviously a kind of a fictional character. At the time, he represented someone who was taking care of the business. He was watching out for the customer and making sure that they were going to be safe and taken care of at Jack in the Box. And as soon as we launched the campaign with Jack, our business pretty much turned around overnight. The promotions that we had tried before the campaign, which had utterly failed, once we did them after the campaign, were very successful. And that got me so interested in how powerful advertising and campaigns and a character, and like a character that was really based in strategy, the kind of impact it would have on a brand. So when it came time for my husband to go to postgrad, to do his postgrad work, he was kind of looking at some options, and it looked like he was going to end up in New York. And I said, great, I'm going to go work for an advertising agency on Madison Avenue. And that's basically what I did. It wasn't on Madison Avenue, but it was definitely a New York agency. Had a great experience there, working on the Burger King account. So definitely have a lot of fast food in my background, but, just kind of, it's an interesting journey from kind of observing how powerful advertising could be to then working at an agency and understanding how you develop insights, how do you work with creatives to come up with, campaigns and strategies that can really impact the business. It was a great experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I so remember the Jack is the CEO campaign. It was so just irreverent and smart and catchy. It was like almost impossible not to love him and like him. I remember everyone was driving around with those little Jack heads on their antenna. All over. Yeah. And by the way, I have a dirty secret. I loved Jack in the Box tacos very late at night when I was living in Los Angeles. So if you had anything to do with those,
My secret is that I still love them. So don't tell, well, now I feel for the whole audience, but no, I mean, there's something in me that Jack in the Box taco, it calls to.
Yeah. They're unique and very special. But so when you first saw that Jack is the CEO, did you really believe and think, hey, this is going to be awesome? Or were you skeptical before it launched?
Frankly, I was very skeptical. And I was also, I kind of maybe was an agency hater, because, frankly, because, like here I am, heading research and analytics and trying to develop all these great customer insights. And, here are these the cool guys from Los Angeles with, the stereotypical ad guy with the ponytail and the cool clothes and the hip attitude. And, they come in and they had definitely done rigorous research. I'm not saying that they didn't, but they just came in and said, forget everything, here's what you need to do. And, at the time, the leadership of the company was so desperate, they were just like, okay, fine, we trust you, let's do it. And I felt like, wait a minute, doesn't it matter what I think and what shouldn't we validate this? Shouldn't we do our own research? Shouldn't we, test different options? And so I was just kind of, I don't even know if skeptical is the right word. I was just kind of like, almost feeling a little put off by the whole process. But I soon became a believer once we saw those results.
Yeah. I mean, not very hard to be an agency hater sometimes, but they do have their place. And so, I love your story. You're obviously super smart and talented. You're working hard. You're making things happen. You go to New York. You're working at the ad agency. You're working on the Burger King account. And I want to ask, I mean, you kind of brought this up a little bit, but you're a woman of Asian American heritage. I mean, was it tough?
Looking back, I definitely can see times when I was not respected or taken seriously, whether because I was a woman or because I was an Asian American. And I would say that growing up in the Midwest, I definitely experienced racism and discrimination. I remember, getting made fun of. But at the time, I think culturally, as well as, how my parents raised me and also just kind of the Chinese American, like, ethos or whatever, I always felt like there was something wrong with me. So instead of the person who's, calling me names because I'm Chinese and me thinking that they're bad, I was kind of like feeling very badly about myself. And I have to say that I've only really come to this realization in the last 6 months or even last 3 months since all the awareness about racial inequity and racism in this country. And I've really now kind of thought about it. And I'm like, you know what, I was discriminated against, but I didn't think I didn't think I needed to put these people in their place. I was kind of like, there's something wrong with me that I have to be different. So I really tried to assimilate as much as possible. That's what my parents were very much into. And so in some ways, I kind of was just like, I just need to blend in and kind of, work as hard as I can. And if I do great work, it'll get recognized. And I think, fortunately, I ended up in situations where that did happen, but I know that a lot of people aren't as fortunate, and they end up working really hard, but not really getting anywhere. So, yes, so that's a long answer to your question. Yes, it was hard, but I think some of it was probably I put on myself.
Yeah, and I'm just here a little bit in shock, thinking about how difficult that must have been to think like, well, I'm the problem, and the way people are acting is the norm. And if I speak up, it's just going to create problems. And either at the very base level, people won't like me, and at a more extreme it becomes unsafe. Or a more extreme level, it becomes unsafe,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
on a variety of levels, whether that's directly like from a physical standpoint, or even just like, hey, I might lose my job, and
Yeah.
I just thinking about that for you. It must have been extremely difficult, but you were able to push through. And what do you think, what do you attribute that to? Now that you say you've just recently had some awareness, I think it sounds like you've been meditating on this
Mm-hmm.
idea a little bit. Like, how do you think you were able
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to push through? Because certainly there were obstacles in the way.
Right. I owe it to my faith. So I'm a person of faith, and I came to that faith around the same time that I started my professional career. And I think that having a belief in God and knowing that God has a purpose for my life enabled me, and today continues to enable me to derive my identity from my relationship with God, and not my work or my work product or what other people think about my work. Now, that's not to say that, I don't care about, producing results or getting accolades. I'm human. And so it is important for people to respect and admire me or whatever, blah, 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 But I think that fundamentally, I am secure in who I am. I'm secure in why I'm here. I'm secure in what good I need to be doing through my work. And so I think because of that, some of the things that may have held me back or would maybe be more hurtful to other people just hasn't been as much of an issue for me.
Yeah. And so how did you come to this relationship with your faith and it becoming such a driver in your life?
Yeah, well, I grew up going to church all the time, but the church I went to, frankly, was, just all the people there were either, old ladies, really nice old ladies, but old ladies, or families where the woman didn't work outside of the home, and so it was very kind of traditional, and not. There were no real role models for me as someone who was interested in work and interested in developing a career. So when in my first year working at Spiegel, one of my coworkers invited me to his church, and it ended up being this awesome experience where I saw all these people who were very, at least to me, seemed very successful in their careers, but who were loving God and getting, like I said, kind of their identity and their center in Him. And I thought, okay, maybe this thing really is for me after all. It's been a long journey. So like I said, that was almost 25 plus years ago. I think that, I continue to learn more and more about God's vision for me and the impact that He wants to make through me. And that continues to be kind of a driver, and both a driver and a compass, so it's kind of a motivator, but then it's also allowing Him to shape my attitudes and my decisions, and ultimately the work that I do. I don't know. Did I answer your question now that I'm thinking about it? I'm not sure I answered your question.
I think so. I think you're close. I got another one. Okay. I do find it really fascinating, and probably because faith wasn't a huge driver in my life. And I think, and when it was, I had a Jewish father and a mother who was Protestant. And so I was always like kind of confused, more or less, and I didn't know which side, didn't know which side of the fence I fell on. But, I think about, for you, was this something that was an asset for your career, or was it something you kind of kept a little on the down low, or was it something that really helped, fuel your relationships within the business world, and that was a part of your career as you were building that career?
Yeah, that is such a good question, Mark, because I have to confess that for many years I was in the closet about being a Christian. I didn't want anyone to know, did not talk about it at all. And I think that's because, number one, there are a lot of negative perceptions about Christians, some of them well-deserved, but just in general, there's a lot of negativity. And number two, I always kind of got the perception that other people thought that people of faith were maybe less intelligent, just less thoughtful, less worthy of respect. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but I kind of just got the sense of that. And I really wanted to establish myself as, this quote unquote expert, so for a long time, I just didn't talk about my faith at all. And it's really probably been only in the last few years that I've become much more open about it. And in fact, if you had asked me 5 years ago to do this interview, we would not be talking about this. I guarantee you, I would have just kind of deflected and just maintained this conversation about passion for brands without linking that to my identity and what I think the purpose of my life is. So it's a relatively new thing for me to share, but I've come to realize that, people want to know me. They don't want to know, they don't want this like facade or image to be in the kind of a mediator for who I am. And so I've tried to be much more transparent about my beliefs and my faith. And so, it's just kind of been part of that revealing. And it's been really rewarding. I don't think anyone that I've ever, shared about, this has been my journey, has had a negative reaction, or if they have, they haven't had it in front of me. I think a lot of people enjoy talking about what their spiritual backgrounds were and how they were raised and how that impacts what they believe in now. And I think that, ultimately part of my identity is to really be a servant, to serve other people. And so when I'm sharing that with people, I think people appreciate that and know that I'm not trying to push my faith on them. I'm not trying to evangelize or whatever, but I'm really trying to understand, how can I help you? How can I serve you? How can we do great things together that we both really love and produce something really cool? So it's been affirming.
Yeah, well, thank you for showing up as your authentic self. I appreciate that. And it's nice to hear about it. This episode brought to you by Wild Story. Wait, isn't that your company? It is. And without the generous support of Wild Story, this show would not be possible. A brand isn't a logo or a tagline or even your product. A brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, service, or company. It's what people say about you when you're not in the room. Wild Story helps progressive founders and savvy marketers build purpose-driven brands that connect their business goals with the customers they want to serve so that both the business and the customer needs are met. This results in crazy, happy, loyal customers that purchase again and again, and this is great for business. If that sounds like something you and your team might want to learn more about, reach out at www.wildstory.com and we'd be happy to tell you more. Now back to our show. So you are in New York City and you're working at the ad agency, but where are you in your career now? I mean, are you, I don't know the right way to say this. Are you kind of just, I'll just say like a worker bee? Are you still just kind of in the trenches, like doing your thing? Are you starting to get notoriety as a branding expert? Like what's going on for you in New York City?
Yeah, well, the first agency I worked for in New York, was Ammirati Puris Lintas, and Lintas had been like this huge agency. So it was this huge agency, and I was definitely just kind of like a small fish in a very big pond, just worker bee. But then I had the opportunity to go be like the sole account planner. So an account planner is the person who's kind of responsible for the strategy of the account, to head up and be the kind of driver of strategy at a smaller agency, Grace and Rothschild. And now this agency was small, but it was definitely had big impact. It worked on the Land Rover Land Rover business for many years and came out with all of the kind of iconic Land Rover advertising as well as other business. And it was kind of there where I ended up being kind of a bigger fish in a smaller pond. And I felt like I could really have more impact and influence on the creative work and influence on the client and their strategies. So, there was kind of this more development of, hey, I have something of value to offer, I think, when I went to that agency. And then Sony Electronics came and recruited me out of that small agency to go head up their first ever brand office in the US. At the time, Sony, it was kind of their heydays. It was like people bought the products, paid tons of money for them. Everyone thought that Sony's products were like the coolest and the latest technology. But they'd never had anyone to work on their brand, which is kind of strange. And we can get into that. But anyway, so once I went to Sony, then I felt like that was an affirmation that, yes, I'm developing expertise. And at the same time, the experience at Sony taught me so much about kind of the internal operationalization of your brand and the engagement of your stakeholders. And all of the stuff that I work on now really came to me as part of my Sony experience. So it was just a great both development opportunity as well as, I think, an establishment of me as a brand strategist.
Yeah, and that's like a huge leap. So, you're working at this, other agency, Grace and Rothschild, and cool agency doing some cool work. But to go head up a brand like Sony, I mean, were you scared?
Definitely. But you know what? Like, I think it's a little bit of imposter syndrome, and particularly for female imposter syndrome that, I remember thinking, do these people know who I am and what they're hiring? But the mere fact that they had faith in me and that they, saw something in me. And then I had a great immediate manager as well as the kind of chief marketing officer. Both of them were just terrific role models and taught me so much. And I think that whatever fear or self-doubt I had was quickly addressed by how much confidence they had in me.
And so what did that tenure at Sony look like? Or, would you accomplish, and why did you ultimately leave?
Yeah. So I was there for about 5 or 6 years, and the first 3 were amazing. I was working for this great CMO, and even the president of the company at the time really believed in brand building. And actually, I should say that, when I first started at Sony was when they first started to see some sort of softness in their business. And fortunately, the CMO and the president at the time had the foresight to say, you know what, we need to reinvigorate our brand. But we're not going to do that by just creating a huge brand campaign. We're actually going to turn our focus internally and make sure that everyone inside the organization shared one common understanding of what Sony needed to become, how it needed to evolve, what were the values and the vision that it needed to embrace in order to move it forward. And so for the first 3 years, that's all I worked on. And we created this program called Being Sony, where we engaged everyone throughout the company on what the Sony brand was and how each person in the organization could interpret and reinforce and nurture that understanding. But there's always a but, and that is that within the 5-ish years that I was at the company, I think it's like 5 different bosses and 3 different presidents, or vice versa, 3 bosses, and there was tons of turnover. And this great CMO that I worked for left, and what I was working on all of a sudden just wasn't important anymore. And so after a few more years of me banging my head against the wall. In fact, I always say that I still have bruises on my forehead from that. Just trying to kind of move the organization forward in the direction I thought it needed to be. I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to leave Sony. I should mention that midway through my time at Sony, I went from working in their New Jersey office. They relocated me back to San Diego, which at that time I loved. I had loved I fell in love with San Diego. Wanted to get back there. So that was perfect. The problem with San Diego is though is that there are not a lot of consumer brands based there, and so there are not a lot of great consumer marketing jobs. And in fact, I don't say this to brag, but I think I probably had the best consumer marketing job in San Diego as heading up brand and strategy for Sony. And so here I am trying to look for another job, and it's like, it's crazy, So that's when, thanks to some, encouragement from others who said, you would actually be a really good independent advisor. I decided I was going to resign my job and start my own consulting practice. And so that's what I did back in 2004.
Yeah, and then we're back to where I believe your father is thinking, what are you doing?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he's scared for you. He's terrified. But you had enough belief in yourself to do that. Like, what was calling to you to be independent? What hadn't you done, or why did you need to do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I probably shouldn't say this because the people in corporate America wouldn't like this, but Sony sponsored me to go to a leadership development program in my last year with the company. And one of the things that the founder of this development program, she had this saying that she said, some jobs are too small for some spirits. And it was just this idea that, if you have like a passion and a drive to do something in your work and your job is not allowing you to do it, you need to go get another job or you need to go do something else. And I realized that probably, the best way for me to do this was going to be on my own. I will have to say that for the first couple years of me being out on my own, I always thought, oh, you know what, if this doesn't work out, I can just go back and get another corporate job. So it wasn't like I was completely committed to it. But I did think that I could have a lot more impact on a lot more companies if I were out on my own than working in one company and dealing with all of the, setbacks and disappointments that I had at Sony.
Yeah. And so what was the plan? Like, who was your first customer?
I always tell people who are thinking about leaving corporate and and starting their own business, that your customers, your clients will not be the people you think they will be. And so, I thought, all these people that I'd met through Sony, of course they're going to have me, come and consult for them. And no one did. I want to say that actually an advertising agency might have been my first client. And the only reason why they hired me to work with them is because they were pitching a piece of business to that CMO that I'd worked for at Sony. And so they wanted to know everything about him and his philosophy about brand building, et cetera. So they hired me just to tell him that. I think that might have been my first consulting gig. But what ended up happening is I just would do a lot of business development and a lot of networking. I recontacted tons of people. And one of a client that ended up being a really great client for a couple of years was VF Corporation. They own a lot of brands from the North Face to Eagle Creek. And I had met a guy who worked for VF at a conference, several years before I left Sony. And when I left Sony, I recontacted him and said, hey, just want to let you know I'm out on my own. He ended up bringing me into that organization. And because VF had all these different brands, I was able to work on multiple projects for multiple brands. So that really just kind of established me. But I have to confess that this guy who got me into the company, if I had run into him on the street, I don't think I would have recognized him because like I said, I had met him at a conference several years ago. I just reached out to him just kind of in my networking, and he ended up being such a great advocate for me. We ended up reconnecting in person. So now I definitely know what he looks like and we have a friendship, but that's what I mean by like your business is not going to come from where you think it is. It's going to come from the most surprising places. And I think that's in part because when you are well known in one way, it's really hard for people to then think of you in a different way. And so everyone who had known me as this kind of brand and strategy person at Sony couldn't see me working on like Nautica, or Nautica jeans. They just couldn't make that leap, and they couldn't see me actually developing a whole kind of business and brand plan because they had seen me in this very narrow window. Whereas people who didn't know me as that only saw that, yeah, I used to head up brand and strategy for Sony. They were like, oh, okay, we believe that you can do that. And so I think that's why different people ended up hiring me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And it's really interesting. And I'm just thinking, I'm very familiar with VF. They've relocated their headquarters to Denver. Personally know a lot of people that work there. Very kind of outdoorsy, cool brand. And so just thinking about how you got in there, what a great story. I mean, not an easy company to land as your first client. And you start building up your consultancy, and then what happens?
Yeah. And then through the church that I was attending at the time, we put on this program where we did all these different assessments. So we did the Myers-Briggs assessment. We did the Strengths Finder assessment. We also did like the spiritual gifts assessment, which is based on the biblical teaching that different people are gifted in different ways. Anyway, I did all these assessments, and I realized that what I really wanted to do, and really what I was built for, was to be kind of, again, I hate these terms, but kind of more of like a thought leader and a speaker, So instead of, just doing consulting projects, I really kind of realized that what was the best fit for me was to be a speaker and a writer, kind of getting my ideas and doing research and then getting my ideas out to as many people as possible. So I started kind of thinking, okay, well, how do I become a speaker? And granted, as a consultant, I would go to conferences and speak for business development purposes, but, I would be speaking for free, whereas I wanted to become a professional speaker, and I, in my research on that, I realized that I needed to have a book, which is kind of crazy. It's just this weird thing. And I don't know if you found this to be the case, Mark, but, just somehow when you have a book, then people think that you have something worthwhile listening to. So I needed to write a book. And I tried for several years to write a book, had put away, at one point, I talked with a publisher who said, you've got a great marketing platform, because I wrote this book proposal all about how I was going to promote the book. She said, you've got this great marketing platform, but you don't have the content of the book yet. So I put it away for a while. I was like, okay, great. I'm just going to be a consultant, whatever. And then I just could not let go of this drive to be a speaker. So, and I also ended up connecting with an editor who I just thought would really help me write the book I needed to. And that's where What Great Brands Do came. And so What Great Brands Do came out in 2014. And so since like probably 2013, I've really been building this business as a keynote speaker more and more, such that I only take a few consulting clients, even just a couple consulting clients or engagements a year. And most of my time is spent speaking.
Yeah, and so that's a great segue. So what do great brands do?
Well, I do have these 7 principles that separate the best from the rest, Mark, in my book. but the number one thing, and the very first chapter of What Great Brands Do, is great brands start inside. Meaning that great brands aren't built by their external communications and their logos and all that stuff. They're built by cultivating a strong brand-led culture inside the organization. And if you are able to articulate an overarching purpose and core values that not only motivate customers but also motivate employees, then you can build this brand that has so much impact and so much authenticity and so much integrity. And so then just to kind of close the loop on this idea of starting inside, that's how I ended up writing my most recent book, Fusion, How Integrating Brand and Culture Powers the World's Greatest Companies. Because the more and more I worked on brand building, I realized that idea of starting inside is something that more and more businesses need to know about. And so I ended up writing a book solely on that idea.
Yeah, and I agree. Like in my experience, a lot of companies view those two things as mutually exclusive when in fact they're oftentimes, especially like, a company like VF where like culture is the brand, for a lot of those the brands that they own, you know, it is important to start inside. And so what are some of the biggest sort of mistakes you're seeing from brands when they try to start, building from the inside when it comes to purpose and values?
I would say the lack of leadership responsibility for culture building is probably one of the biggest mistakes, in the sense that you might hear like the CEO or the leader of the company kind of talk about we have a great culture, we need to work on our culture, but they're not accepting responsibility for really shaping what that culture is or should be, and moving the organization towards it. I think that there's often this sense either our culture is just kind of grow organically. Just if I talk about it, it'll happen. If I build it, it'll come. Or B, that's HR's job. So I'm going to tell the HR folks, you need to work on our culture and come back to me in 6 months or a year and tell me, report to me what progress you've made, without really recognizing that there's so much in the way the organization is run and the way the organization is designed, and all these different aspects of the employee experience, some of which do fall under HR responsibilities, but a lot of it falls outside of that. All of these things shape your culture. And so I think there's just kind of this kind of hands-off approach to culture, which holds a lot of companies back.
Yeah, I think the biggest red flag I heard when I asked once who owns the culture here, the answer was everybody owns the culture, and I thought, well, no one owns the culture, and you're in trouble.
Right.
You're in trouble.
Yeah,
so yeah.
Yeah.
So,
No, it's true. I will say that it's true that everyone plays their part. In fact, I was just talking with someone earlier today about how everyone does contribute to the culture, but if the leadership isn't driving that forward, isn't setting the tone, setting the priorities, and making sure that everyone in the organization understands what kind of culture we're going after, then yeah, you're right. No, you're not going to make progress. So it's kind of one of these things that yes, everyone is involved, but the leaders are responsible for championing it and leading it and moving it forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when it comes to brand, like what are you most excited about right now? What are you seeing and what are you excited about as we kind of enter a crazy world these days? Something that's a little different and something that's being reshaped and remade in a lot of ways, both with the diversity and equity issues we're seeing, as well as with COVID. I mean, there's a lot going on that's putting a lot of pressure on brands, but I also think is impacting, how we as consumers feel about brands.
Yeah. So I would say two things, and they're probably related to some extent, and they're both definitely a result of the current situation with the pandemic and also the civil unrest. One is that I think there's elevated expectations on brands from their customers and from the media and kind of other stakeholders that these brands need to be, I wouldn't even call it like responsible corporate citizens. They need to be creating value for their communities and for their customers and for the world that that is a real positive impact. And because people have the visibility to see kind of what these companies are doing now, it's not enough for a company just to kind of do some social responsibility effort off to the side. I think there's an expectation that the way that you run your business needs to create shared value, the value that everyone who's involved in your business can share, that actually elevates your communities, elevates your employees, elevates your customers, elevates the world. So I think that that's one trend or one development that I think if companies rise up and step up to the challenge, we will see businesses dramatically changed for the better. And then the other is that the employee experience has been completely disrupted. In fact, I just released an article in Forbes about this, that you cannot deny that what your employees are experiencing, or what your employees need and what they expect, and kind of what they're experiencing now has not just changed dramatically over the last few months. And that therefore you as a leader need to redesign your employee experience. You can't rely on people coming to your campus and kind of, soaking in the culture through the ethos. And the ethos is something that just kind of happens, which it never did in the past, but it definitely makes it clear that you can't be thinking about your culture in terms of space or place and time, but you need to be thinking about engaging every one of your employees in their, individual needs and in their individual context. And so just the fact that you can't ignore that, and that business leaders are going to have to address that, I'm excited about, because I think the way that companies engage their employees could, again, be completely different. And I think if companies really step into that opportunity, both the businesses as well as the people will be so much better.
Yeah, and that sounds like a world I want to be a part of. It sounds like not only are we creating commerce and value in companies, but we're creating more value in the world.
Yes, and there's not this kind of inside the organization, outside the organization kind of divide, but like it's the company really views everyone who's involved in their business as a stakeholder, and how can we create value, and how can we have a positive impact on all of these groups.
Denise, tell me about flying a helicopter.
Oh, so that was on my bucket list. And so last year I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. So I took flight lessons for about 9 months, and it is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, Mark. And I think I've done some hard things in my life, but and I think that I'm pretty coordinated. Growing up as a ballet dancer, I kind of feel like I have fairly good coordination. But the thing about a helicopter is that all 4 of your appendages, right arm, left arm, and 2 of your feet or legs, are doing different things. One is going back and forth, side, and the other is going side to side, and your feet are steering. And it's not the kind of thing like a fixed wing aircraft, nor like a car, where you could take your hands off the controls and you would still basically kind of go in the same direction unless something dramatic happened. Like every moment, every second that you are in the cockpit, you are making micro adjustments just to keep the helicopter afloat. And like I said, it was the most difficult thing. I remember after several lessons, I asked my flight instructor, I'm like, do you ever have people who you just don't think are ever going to get this? And basically asking him, do you think I should just give up? And fortunately, he was nice enough to be like, no, you really, it just takes time. And he said, there will be a moment when it'll click and you'll be able to do it. And so I ended up getting to that moment. I ended up doing my first solo flight, and it was just an extraordinary feeling. And I think something that I was really proud of that I was able to do.
Yeah, why was that important to you to learn to fly a helicopter?
Well, I mean, it was really stupid in a way, because I had gone to Hawaii and we had gone on this awesome helicopter ride where they took us, I guess this was on, I can't remember what island it was. We basically flew straight into we were looking eye level at the top of a waterfall. And then we basically went straight down and landed at the foot of the waterfall, got out, took pictures or whatever. And then we, left, we went straight up, and then we, went around or whatever. And I thought, that is the coolest thing in the world. I want to be able to do that. It was just kind of one of those things where it was such a memorable experience. And it is very much unlike flying, because, I travel so much that I get on a plane, I don't even think about, what's involved, that we're taxiing down the runway and then taking off at, these ginormous speeds in order to get afloat. The helicopter experience is so different. And I just felt like I want to do that. And little did I know how hard it was. Little did I know how expensive it is. But yeah, like I said, I was just so happy that I was able to do it.
Denise, thank you for sharing that. As we end get to the end of the interview here, if you ran into your 8-year-old self, that little Denise in St. Louis, in her ballet outfit, her tutu, what do you think she'd say if she saw you today?
Oh, wow. I would think that she would be kind of proud and excited about what I was able to accomplish. At the same time, I think that she would, if she knew what I had gone through in the interim, she would know about some of the waste in my life in terms of before I came to faith, and the stupid things that I did where I was just kind of wasting my talent and potential. And she would maybe think, gosh, you could have been even more had you not made those mistakes. But I think overall, I think that she would be excited about what has happened.
Denise, where can listeners find out more about you and get in contact with you if they have some questions about anything you shared today?
Well, Mark, thank you so much for asking. The best place to go is my website, deniseleeyohn.com. And it's really kind of a portal to everything. So there you can learn about me as a keynote speaker and watch my videos. You can access my social media accounts. You can access my all of the articles I write for the Harvard Business Review and Forbes and other outlets. So you can access all those articles there, as well as my blog and newsletter. So really, deniseleeyohn.com is the place to go to then engage in whatever way. And I will say that I really enjoy connecting with new people, just like this connection that you and I have now, Mark. I'm just so thankful that, through these different people that we know and different channels, we can actually meet new people and develop new relationships and just grow as people. So please reach out to me. I would love to hear from you.
Fantastic. And I can vouch for Denise's newsletter. I love her emails. They're full of gold nuggets. So go ahead and sign up. I think it's a great resource. And Denise, thank you so much for being on the show.
Mark, thank you. It's been great.
And that is Denise Lee Yohn. I loved her comment that people identify with brands that get them, that help them to identify themselves. Think about that one for a moment. And Denise, thank you for sharing your story in an authentic and vulnerable way. I so appreciate that you showed up as you are and didn't hold anything back. I'll say back to you what you said in our interview. You make me want to be better. And we'll make sure to link to all things Denise Lee Yohn in the show notes, so please check out all the free resources she makes available. Thank you again to Denise Lee Yohn. Well, that's the show. Until next time. Make sure to visit our website, www.wildstory.com, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode.
I like big stories and I cannot lie. You other storytellers can't deny.